billionaire thought it would be amusing, a cruel inside joke among the elite. He invited Ava Coleman, the black cleaning woman who had quietly worked in his mansion for years, to his extravagant gala. But when she arrived, she didn't come as a servant. She entered like royalty, and what happened next left every guest speechless. Inside the opulent Bennett estate in Beverly Hills, the night was in full swing. Laughter echoed across marble floors, and golden chandeliers sparkled like stars. Then the room fell silent. Ava was descending the grand staircase, dressed in a breathtaking emerald gown that shimmered with every step. Her posture was regal, her presence undeniable, but the laughter that followed wasn't admiration. It was laced with cruelty. Guests whispered behind crystal glasses. "Isn't that the maid?" Someone scoffed. "She probably maxed out her credit cards for that dress," another muttered. Jonathan Bennett, the billionaire host, smirked beside his wife Emily. "She actually came," he said under his breath. "Let's see how long she lasts." Emily chuckled. 10 minutes, tops. What they didn't know was that Ava wasn't the woman they thought she was. She wasn't here to entertain them. She had grown up in houses just like this one, before life took a different turn, and she had spent 2 years watching from the shadows, learning their patterns, their arrogance, their blind spots. This night wasn't a mistake. It was her moment. The golden invitation Jonathan handed her 3 days before, laced with sarcasm and condescension, was supposed to humiliate her, but Ava accepted it with calm certainty. "I'll be there," she said, and meant it. As she walked deeper into the ballroom, guests began to murmur. Some eyes widened, others narrowed. But Ava didn't shrink. Her every step was deliberate, her gaze steady. And when she locked eyes with Jonathan across the room, something in his expression shifted. His smile faltered. For a flicker of a second, he looked unsure. Emily leaned in. "She's too calm," she whispered. "Something's not right." They were right to worry, because Ava hadn't come to play their game. She'd come to end it. And by the end of the night, it wouldn't be her dignity on trial. It would be theirs. Jonathan only smirked. "Just wait," he whispered to Emily, convinced the joke was still his to enjoy. But what neither of them realized was that Ava Coleman was no one's pawn. She had weathered storms far worse than their ridicule, and tonight she was ready. With each step down the staircase, Ava silently declared the strength she had earned through years of survival. Beneath the elegance and calm was a plan forged with patience and precision. When she reached Jonathan and Emily, she offered a graceful, enigmatic smile and paused. Then, dipping into a subtle curtsy, her eyes locked on his. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Bennett," she said smoothly. "It's a meaningful night for all of us to better understand each other." Her words landed with more weight than Jonathan could comprehend. Before he could reply, she slipped effortlessly into the crowd, leaving him standing still, uncertain. The room was still buzzing, but the tone had shifted. The laughter had quieted. Whispers floated from corner to corner, not of mockery, but confusion. How was she so calm? Why wasn't she breaking? Jonathan's hand trembled slightly around his glass. What had been meant as a cruel spectacle was becoming something else, something he couldn't control. What he didn't know was that Ava had waited years for this moment. Tonight wasn't about embarrassment. It was the opening act of her long-awaited reckoning, one designed to flip the power dynamic and expose everything he'd tried to bury. As she moved through the glittering crowd, Ava held her head high. Not only did she belong here, she always had. The guests watched her in stunned silence, unable to place this version of the woman they thought they knew, but they didn't know her past. Not really. In a quiet corner, Ava paused beside an ornate table. Her fingers traced the edge of a ring on her hand, a striking blue gem set in platinum, a family heirloom. a symbol of the very legacy Jonathan had tried to erase. The guest couldn't have guessed that Ava Coleman was more than a cleaner. Long before tragedy, she had been part of this family, raised in this very mansion. Her father, Edward Bennett, had once been the true architect behind the family fortune. But 2 decades ago, after his sudden and suspicious death, Jonathan, Ava's half-brother, swept in like a shadow. Driven by greed, he dismantled her world. Ava and her mother were cast out, left to struggle in silence while Jonathan rose to power. The gown Ava wore tonight wasn't random either. It had belonged to her mother, the same dress she wore to the last gala before everything crumbled. Every thread was a memory, every fold a reminder of the betrayal they had endured. This wasn't just fashion. It was a symbol of return, of unfinished business. Suddenly, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Well, that's a lovely dress. You must have borrowed it for the night, sneered Cynthia Evans, the senator's wife, one of many who'd always looked at Ava as if she were invisible. Ava turned calmly, her eyes cold and unwavering. "Thank you, Mrs. Evans," she said, voice velvet smooth. "This gown carries a history I think would truly surprise you." Cynthia frowned. "History? From where? A thrift store?" Ava's smile deepened, sharper now. Sometimes the most important stories of a family aren't told by the ones at the podium. They live in the hands of those you never noticed. You'll understand that very soon. Cynthia stepped back, visibly shaken by Ava's sudden presence, her voice, her power. She turned and melted into the crowd. Across the room, Jonathan and Emily watched with rising unease. Emily leaned close, her voice low, for once unsure. "What is she doing, Jonathan? She's not acting like someone embarrassed. She's too calm." Jonathan shook his head, forcing a laugh he didn't quite believe. "She's bluffing. That's all this is. She has nothing." But in the pit of his stomach, for the first time, Jonathan Bennett felt it. Doubt. "She's just trying to rattle us," Jonathan muttered, attempting to sound confident. But deep down, something had begun to stir, a fear he'd buried along with the secrets he never wanted exposed. From her quiet corner, Ava Coleman watched him with a calm intensity that felt anything but passive. The guests had no idea what she carried, no clue that she was holding the very truth that could burn down Jonathan's empire. This night was only beginning. Emily, sensing the shift, leaned in and whispered sharply, "Are you really going to let her ruin our event? Do something." Jonathan forced a smile, cold and brittle. "Let's see how long she can keep up that act," he replied, but his voice was thinner now. He moved toward her, flanked by his usual entourage, men who thrived on power games and cruelty. "That dress is stunning, Ava," he said with mock admiration, his tone soaked in sarcasm. "Never imagined someone in your position could afford something like that." Laughter erupted around him. Another voice joined in. Did she spend her entire savings on it? They waited for her to break, but she didn't. Ava turned to face them, her gaze steady, her smile serene. "Thank you for your concern," she said softly. "But value isn't measured by a price tag. It's in the story behind it. And this dress, well, it carries a story you wouldn't believe." Jonathan's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected poise. He hadn't expected strength. Martha Sullivan, always eager to reassert control, stepped forward with a smug smile. "You talk like you've lived among us, Ava. What would you know about legacies or high society?" Ava's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sometimes the people you overlook know more than you think, and sometimes the truth comes from places you've tried very hard to ignore, like Jonathan Bennett." The name hit like a lightning bolt. Jonathan's face tightened. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he snapped. Ava tilted her head, calm as ever. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just telling the truth, a truth you know very well." Silence swallowed the room. The laughter was gone. In its place, uncertainty, dread, and something deeper. Across the ballroom, Emily's face turned pale. She clutched her husband's arm. "Jonathan, maybe we should stop this." He pulled away. "She's bluffing. She has nothing." But his voice lacked conviction. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control, and Ava could see it. She held her wineglass with the ease of a queen, took a slow sip, and set it down as if marking the start of something irreversible. She had waited for this moment, not to humiliate him, but to unravel the false world he'd built. What began as a joke was now spiraling into a reckoning. Ava Coleman wasn't just standing her ground. She was about to strike, and everyone in that ballroom would soon realize that the woman they mocked was carrying a truth powerful enough to shatter everything they thought was untouchable. As the crystal lights above flickered ever so slightly, Jonathan's hands trembled. He was no longer hosting a party. He was standing at the edge of exposure. A hush fell over the ballroom, broken only by a rising wave of uneasy murmurs. Eyes darted between Ava and Jonathan, confusion giving way to curiosity, then concern. Something was unraveling, and no one, not even the most powerful guests, could look away. Ava stepped into the center of the room, the crystal lights above catching in her dark gown, turning the moment into something dreamlike, almost cinematic. Her voice rang out, clear, calm, unshakable. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, silencing the room, "I believe it's time you learned the truth Jonathan Bennett has been hiding for 2 decades. Jonathan stepped forward instinctively, his voice sharp with panic. "Don't do this, Ava. What are you trying to prove?" She met his eyes, steel in her voice. "This game? You started it, Jonathan, but I'm the one finishing it." Gasps rippled across the crowd. Emily's face had gone pale, her fingers clenching the fabric of her gown as if searching for something solid. With measured grace, Ava removed a ring from her hand, the deep blue gemstone catching the light like fire. "Do you recognize this?" she asked softly. "It's the Bennett family heirloom, my father's last gift before he died." A wave of whispers surged across the room. Faces turned in disbelief. Some of the very people who had mocked Ava now leaned in, stunned. Jonathan's expression collapsed. "That's a lie! She's making this up!" he shouted, but the shakiness in his voice betrayed him. Unbothered, Ava continued, "My name is Ava Coleman Bennett. I am Jonathan's half-sister. He erased me from this house, from this family, but this ring carries a truth that can't be denied." Her words dropped like thunder. The hall exploded with chaos, guests talking over one another, trying to make sense of what they'd just heard. Emily reached for a nearby chair, unsteady, her eyes fixed on Jonathan with a mix of betrayal and shock. Jonathan tried to laugh it off, his voice cracking. "It's a fake. She has no proof, just a cheap ring and a story." But Ava stepped forward, quiet and controlled. "You know whether it's real, Jonathan. You know what you did, and so do I. I've waited years for this moment, not to destroy you, but to finally speak what I've carried in silence." Jonathan recoiled slightly, the weight of the crowd's suspicion pressing in on him. He turned to Emily for support, but she was no longer beside him. She stood a few steps away, her face etched with disbelief. "Jonathan," she whispered, barely audible. "Is it true?" Ava straightened, her voice firm. "Let this moment be a reminder. You can bury truth beneath wealth and reputation, but eventually it claws its way to the surface. I didn't come just to reclaim my name. I came to reveal the truth about the man so many of you trusted." Jonathan stood frozen. 20 years of lies were collapsing, brick by brick, and Ava knew this was just the beginning. Then, with the crowd locked in silent suspense, Ava reached into her clutch and pulled out a small audio recorder. Her hand didn't tremble. Her gaze never left Jonathan's. "You think the ring was all I brought?" she said. "It took me years to prepare for tonight. She pressed play. A voice echoed through the ballroom, cold, controlled, unmistakably Jonathan's. "Dr. Carter, list my father's death as a heart attack. If you mention the arsenic, I'll ruin you. Don't test me." Gasps exploded across the room. Several guests instinctively stepped back. Others stared in stunned horror. Jonathan staggered as though struck, his face drained of color, his knees threatening to buckle. The room, once his domain, had turned against him. And Ava, calm, unwavering, stood at the center, the storm he never saw coming. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. The man beside her, the one she had trusted without question, was suddenly unrecognizable. Around them, Jonathan's well-dressed allies slowly stepped back, as if even standing near him might taint their reputations. "This is fake," Jonathan croaked. "You're framing me!" But Ava didn't blink. Her voice rang out with the certainty of someone who had waited her whole life for this moment. "I knew you'd say that, Jonathan. That's why I didn't come alone." The grand doors creaked open. In stepped Dr. Thomas Carter, the longtime Bennett family physician. His posture was rigid with guilt, his silver hair glinting under the chandelier. He made his way through the stunned guests and stopped in the center of the room. His voice trembled, but not from fear. "For 20 years, he began, I stayed silent, not because I wanted to, but because Jonathan Bennett made it clear my career and my family would be ruined if I spoke." Jonathan took a staggering step back, shaking his head in denial. But then came the blow he couldn't escape. "Edward Bennett didn't die of a heart attack," the doctor said. "He was poisoned. I found arsenic in his system. Jonathan forced me to falsify the report." The room erupted. A collective gasp spread like wildfire. Emily let out a broken cry and dropped into the nearest chair, sobbing as she looked at her husband with betrayal in her eyes. Jonathan's face turned ghostly. "No, I didn't mean... It got out of control." Ava's voice cut through him like steel. "What you meant was money, power, and to get them, you murdered your own father, stole our legacy, and watched as my mother and I were thrown into ruin." The crowd stared in disbelief, stepping away from Jonathan as if he carried a curse. His eyes darted around the room in a silent plea for help, but no hand came. Ava stepped closer. Her voice was a whisper, sharp and final. "Your lies are crumbling, Jonathan. You will answer for everything." His knees buckled. He collapsed into a chair, hollow and defeated. Ava turned to the crowd, her voice now steady and filled with purpose. "Tonight, the truth has finally come to light, and Jonathan Bennett will face the consequences he's avoided for far too long." The room fell utterly silent. The woman they once dismissed now stood as a symbol of justice. Ava scanned the faces around her, some still shocked, others quietly ashamed. She had more to say, and they needed to hear it. She took a breath, eyes shining with the pain of memories long buried. "After my father's death, Jonathan didn't just take his life. He took everything else. He forged documents. He stripped my mother and me of our rights. And he claimed every last cent of the inheritance meant for us." Emily, still trembling, looked at Jonathan, searching for a denial that never came. There was nothing left in him but silence. Then Ava turned to her, her tone softer, filled with decades of sorrow. "Do you know why I became the maid in the home where I was born? Because he forced us so far down that we had no choice. My mother begged for work, just so we could survive, just so I could finish school. The house my father built became a prison." Gasps rippled through the crowd again. Those who once mocked her now looked on with awe and guilt. Martha Sullivan shrank back into the crowd. Cynthia Evans stood frozen, her expression blank with shame. Ava pressed on, her voice cracking but firm. "Every day I cleaned those floors, I lived with the ghost of my father. I endured Jonathan's cruelty in silence, watching him celebrate his success, knowing what he had done to get there. Jonathan attempted to stand again, barely able to hold himself upright. I was just trying to. You forced my mother to work herself to death, Ava said, her words like fire. She died with no money for medicine. She died while he sat in luxury, celebrating the theft that broke us. Jonathan sank back, colorless, and the room, the elite, polished room once meant to humiliate Ava, now stared at her in stunned silence. The woman who entered as a joke had become the storm that would end Jonathan Bennett. A stunned silence settled over the ballroom, broken only by the faint murmur of disbelief and betrayal. The air grew dense with unease, pressing on everyone like a weight they couldn't escape. Guests who had once admired Jonathan Bennett now looked at him as if he were something dangerous, something unforgivable. Emily sat collapsed in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, her world unraveling in real time. Around them, former friends drifted away, as though his guilt might cling to them if they stood too close. Ava stepped forward again, her voice low but unwavering. You built your life by stepping on others, Jonathan, but strength doesn't come from control or cruelty. It comes from standing for what's right, something you lost a long time ago. Jonathan opened his mouth, but the words failed. The crowd no longer looked to him for leadership or answers. Their eyes had turned away, toward Ava. She turned to the audience, her voice softer now, but filled with undeniable truth. I want everyone in this room to remember something. Behind wealth and prestige, there can be shadows deeper than you imagine. And even after 20 years, justice still finds its way. The room hung on her words. No one would ever see Jonathan Bennett the same way again. He was no longer the polished tycoon, but a man revealed, his empire built on lies. Jonathan sat motionless, a shell of who he once was, as the crowd distanced themselves further, isolating him in silence. But Ava knew this moment alone wasn't enough. Justice demanded more than shock. It demanded evidence, final, undeniable truth. She gave a quiet nod toward the doors. They opened. 2 figures entered, and the room reacted instantly. The first was renowned journalist Sarah Mitchell, fearless and respected. The second was attorney Alex Turner, known for taking down the powerful and corrupt. Sarah's sharp eyes scanned the crowd as she joined Ava at the center of the room. Turner followed, carrying a thick folder in hand. Jonathan shot to his feet, voice cracking. "What is this? What are you doing here?" Sarah didn't flinch. She simply accepted a remote from Ava, then turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and authoritative, "at the request of Ava Coleman Bennett, we are here to present verified evidence of serious financial crimes committed by Jonathan Bennett over the last 20 years. She clicked. The remote. A screen lit up behind her. Bank records, transaction summaries, internal emails. The room gasped. Ava stood calmly beside them, her face unreadable. These documents show that Jonathan Bennett diverted over $20 million from the Bennett Charitable Fund into private accounts, Sarah continued. Funds meant for community programs were funneled into offshore entities and personal ventures. These fake donations were nothing but a cover. Gasps filled the room as the truth unfolded line by line. Emily's shoulders shook, tears streaming freely as the man she thought she knew became a stranger before her eyes. Jonathan lunged toward the screen, eyes wide. "Stop this! It's fake! You're lying!" Alex Turner stepped between them, firm and controlled. "Mr. Bennett, I advise you to stop right there. Everything presented here is confirmed by federal investigators and regulatory agencies. Your actions are no longer just immoral, they're criminal." Jonathan stumbled back, pale and sweating, as more evidence played, this time audio. His own voice filled the room, calm and calculated, negotiating payoffs, hiding records, protecting his position. If they want to stay quiet, pay them. I won't let this leak. I can't lose everything." The crowd recoiled. Guests turned their backs. Even his oldest supporters lowered their eyes in shame. Cynthia Evans and Martha Sullivan, who had mocked Ava earlier, stood frozen, silent, devastated. Sarah finished the presentation with quiet finality. "All materials have been sent to law enforcement. Mr. Bennett will face multiple charges, including embezzlement, bribery, tax fraud, and obstruction of justice." Then Ava stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "You believed money and influence would protect you, that no one would ever dare speak out. But you were wrong. The truth always rises." Jonathan looked up, his eyes glassy, voice barely a whisper. "Ava, please. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I'm sorry. Please forgive me." Ava's expression turned to stone. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "No, Jonathan, you don't get to ask for forgiveness. Not after everything you did. Some things are beyond apology." And with that, she turned away, leaving him to face the silence, the shame, and the justice he could no longer escape. The room stood frozen, the silence shattered only by whispers of outrage and disbelief. A heavy, suffocating stillness gripped the crowd. No one could reconcile the image of the powerful, polished man they once revered with the shattered figure before them. Emily collapsed into her chair, weeping uncontrollably. The foundation of her life, everything she believed in, had been exposed as a lie. Around Jonathan, former allies stepped back, unwilling to be associated with what he had become. Ava stepped forward, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You spent your life climbing by stepping on others, Jonathan, but true strength comes not from fear or control. It comes from truth, from justice. And those are things you abandoned long ago." Jonathan opened his mouth, searching for a response, but nothing came. He looked around the room for support, only to find cold, turned faces. No one stood with him. Ava turned to the guests, her gaze steady. "Let tonight be a reminder. Behind luxury and power can hide unimaginable darkness, and even after 20 years, justice still finds a way." Her words rang through the hall, final and unignorable. Jonathan slumped where he stood, broken, his legacy crumbling in the very house he once ruled. His eyes darted to Ava, wide and desperate. "Ava, please," he whispered, voice trembling. "You've already won. You have everything you ever wanted." Ava looked at him, not with triumph, but sorrow. "All I ever wanted was justice. Justice for the mother you left in poverty, for the father you betrayed, and that's not something your apologies can undo." Jonathan turned to Emily, reaching out as a last resort. "Emily, I didn't mean for it to end like this. I only wanted to protect us. Our family." Emily pulled away, her face pale with fury and heartbreak. "You destroyed our family," she said through clenched teeth. "You don't get to speak of love or protection, and I'm calling the police." That sentence shattered the final thread of Jonathan's illusion. He looked to the crowd once more, but saw only backs and blank stares. The isolation was complete. Then came the wail of sirens outside. A moment later, a squad of officers entered, led by Chief Samuel Hughes, famed for taking down the untouchable elite. "Jonathan Bennett," Hughes announced firmly, "you are under arrest for the suspected murder of Edward Bennett, embezzlement, bribery, and tax fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Panic seized Jonathan. He resisted, but it was useless. The officers moved swiftly. Within seconds, he was in custody. Then the doors burst open again, this time with a sea of reporters. Flashbulbs exploded. Cameras zoomed in on his ashen face. "Mr. Bennett! Is it true you poisoned your father for control of the company? Any comment on the $20 million you stole from the Bennett Charitable Fund?" Jonathan tried to hide his face, but it was too late. The world was watching. Guests rushed to leave. desperate to escape the storm of scandal now engulfing the once unshakable empire. Emily stood alone, back straight, face tear-streaked but defiant. "I hope you spend the rest of your life remembering what you've done," she said softly. Ava watched in silence as her brother was led away, his steps unsteady, his eyes hollow, the cameras capturing every second of his disgrace. When the great doors closed behind him, a strange calm washed over her. It wasn't victory she felt. It was release. She had honored her mother's memory. She had spoken the truth for her father. She had torn down the lie that had stood for 20 years. But more than money or influence, Jonathan had lost the things he never valued until they were gone: respect, love, and the last shred of dignity. Ava turned back to the remaining guests. Her voice was quiet, but powerful. "Let this moment stay with you. The truth, no matter how long it's buried, will rise, and those who live behind lies will always fall." The room fell into complete silence. When the doors closed for the final time, the Bennett mansion didn't feel like a palace anymore. It felt like a courtroom that had finally delivered its verdict. And Ava Coleman Bennett walked out not as a maid, but as the living proof that justice, no matter how long delayed, always arrives. The name Jonathan Bennett dominated headlines across the nation. News broadcasts, op-eds, and panel discussions dissected every revelation as the trial unfolded. It moved swiftly, but the tension was palpable. Each day in court peeled back more layers, exposing the true extent of his deception, greed, and heartless ambition. On the witness stand, the once imposing businessman appeared almost unrecognizable. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, and utterly dismantled by the weight of truth, Jonathan no longer looked like a man in control. He looked like a man crushed beneath the consequences he thought would never come. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that echoed across the country. Under the eyes of a watching nation, Jonathan Bennett was sentenced to life in prison for the premeditated murder of Edward Bennett, massive financial fraud, and systemic corruption. The court also ordered the seizure of all his remaining assets to compensate those affected, chief among them Ava Coleman Bennett, the sister he had tried to erase. As the judge delivered the sentence, Jonathan sat motionless, head bowed, shoulders trembling. His empire, built on betrayal, had finally crumbled. Emily Bennett, heartbroken and ashamed, filed for divorce soon after and relocated with her children far from Beverly Hills. She vowed never to speak the Bennett name again, a name that, for her, had come to represent betrayal and grief. Ava, meanwhile, declined countless high-profile interview requests. Instead, she held a small press gathering at the office of her attorney and friend, Alex Turner. Before a modest crowd of reporters, she stood calm and composed, her presence commanding even in its simplicity. "My goal was never revenge," Ava said, her voice steady, her eyes full of depth. "Nothing can undo the pain my mother and I lived through. But justice, true justice, is about more than punishment. It's about truth being seen." She paused, letting her words settle in the room. For 20 years, Jonathan Bennett believed power made him untouchable. But today, we've all been reminded, no one is beyond accountability. Reporters fell silent, not from command, but from respect. Ava's quiet courage spoke louder than any scandal. Beside her, Sarah Mitchell, the journalist who helped expose the truth, nodded solemnly, and Alex Turner watched with pride, knowing justice had finally prevailed. Ava's final words struck the deepest chord. "Let my story be a reminder," she said. "Justice may be delayed, but it never disappears, and strength is not found in vengeance. It's found in standing firm for what's right, even when you stand alone." The message spread quickly. Ava Coleman Bennett became a national symbol of integrity. Across the country, people spoke her name with admiration, remembering not just her courage, but the grace with which she delivered truth. That evening, alone in her study, Ava looked at a faded photograph of her parents. A soft smile touched her lips. She had kept her promise. The lives they lost, the pain they endured, it would never be forgotten. And now they could finally rest. But Ava's journey didn't end there. In the months that followed, while the world watched, she returned to the very place where Jonathan's web of deceit had once flourished, the Bennett Corporation headquarters. Stepping into the office where her brother once made ruthless decisions, she felt the weight of history and the responsibility to rewrite it. She gathered the senior leadership team, a mix of old executives and new voices full of hope. And with steady resolve, she declared, "From this day forward, the Bennett name will stand for something new. We will rebuild not on power or profit alone, but on transparency, responsibility, and compassion." There were no threats, no grand speeches, just clarity, leadership born from truth. And in that moment, the company that once symbolized corruption began a new chapter, with Ava Coleman Bennett at the helm, not just as CEO, but as a living reminder that integrity is the foundation of real power. Ava Coleman Bennett didn't pause to celebrate her courtroom victory. While others may have basked in headlines, she went straight to work, determined to transform the very institution her brother had corrupted. She stepped into Jonathan's former office, once the epicenter of greed and unchecked ambition. The air still seemed heavy with past betrayals, but Ava had no intention of preserving the past. She was there to rewrite it. Within days, she summoned the company's leadership, some loyal veterans from Jonathan's era, others new voices eager for change. Standing before them, poised and resolute, she made a declaration that would define a new chapter. From this moment on, the Bennett Corporation will no longer be driven by greed or fear. We will rebuild with purpose, through honesty, empathy, and service to others. Her words weren't just aspirational, they were the foundation of sweeping change. Ava implemented reforms across the board: fair wages, generous benefits, open-door policies. She replaced the toxic culture of silence and fear with one rooted in respect and transparency. She didn't govern from behind a desk. Ava spent hours every day walking the halls, listening to concerns, asking questions, and learning. Her presence wasn't symbolic, it was transformational. But she didn't stop with the company. She launched scholarship funds for employees' children, determined that no child would be denied opportunity the way she once had. She established community grants and supported startups led by the very people her brother had ignored or oppressed: single mothers, former foster youth, immigrants, and survivors of hardship. Every decision she made was grounded in principle. Ava knew that lasting success couldn't come at the expense of others. It had to be built together. Within just 6 months, the results spoke for themselves. The Bennett Corporation, once left reeling by scandal, not only recovered, it soared. Profits surpassed anything achieved under Jonathan's reign. But this time, success wasn't forged through exploitation. It was born of trust, shared vision, and ethical leadership. Business magazines declared Bennett a model for corporate rebirth. Ava's face graced covers, not as a figure of wealth, but as a beacon of change. She was hailed as the face of a new generation, one that valued people over profit and purpose over power. At a celebration honoring the company's renewal, Ava stood on stage before hundreds of employees, many of whom had been with her since the days of silence and struggle. She looked out at them, her voice steady and full of emotion. "Today's success isn't mine, it's ours. This company rose not because of any one leader, but because we chose to lead together, because we chose dignity over dominance, compassion over control, justice over silence." The room erupted in applause, not just for the milestones they had reached, but for the woman who had guided them there. And let this be a reminder, she added. Ethics aren't optional. They're the foundation. We've proven that integrity and prosperity can walk hand in hand. As cheers filled the hall, Ava scanned the crowd. Faces once burdened by fear, now radiant with pride. In their eyes, she saw her mother's resilience, her father's dignity, and the future she had once only dreamed of. This was the real victory. Not the fall of Jonathan Bennett, but the rise of something better in his place. A new legacy, one built on courage, on fairness, and on the unwavering belief that no matter how deep the injustice, truth always finds its voice. And Ava Coleman Bennett had made sure the world would listen. They called her the face of a new era, a leader who placed people and justice above profit. And at the Bennett Corporation's celebration ceremony, Ava stood on stage with pride shining in her eyes. "I want to thank each of you," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "Today's success isn't mine. It belongs to all of us. It's proof that unity, compassion, and shared responsibility are more powerful than fear or control." Hundreds of faces gazed up at her, not with obligation, but with genuine admiration. These were people who had once been overlooked, unheard. Under Ava's leadership, they'd found not only their voice, but their dignity. She continued, her tone sincere and steady. "Ethical values aren't optional. They're a responsibility. We've proven that a company can thrive without sacrificing its conscience." Applause erupted, thunderous, joyful. No one spoke Jonathan's name anymore. He had faded into history. Ava had given them something far greater than profits, a future worth believing in. Standing there, Ava glanced across the crowd and saw pieces of her parents in each person. Not in memory, but in legacy. This was what victory looked like. Not revenge, but the restoration of dignity. In the days that followed, Ava moved into her new home, a place free from the ghosts of Bennett Manor. It was modest, warm, filled with laughter and love. Inside, 2 children sat by the window, Mia with her wide eyes and boundless joy, and Ethan, her older brother, thoughtful beyond his years. When Ava stepped through the door, they lit up. "Mom's home!" Mia squealed, rushing into her arms. Ethan followed quietly, his smile soft but full of trust. In these small, ordinary moments, Ava found something extraordinary. Her life's fight wasn't just for justice, it was for the future, for their future. Each evening, she shared pieces of her story, not to stir anger, but to teach strength, forgiveness, and compassion. She taught them that real power lies not in wealth or revenge, but in kindness, in courage, in choosing to do good even when no one else will. Then, one morning, a letter arrived, faint handwriting, worn paper. It was from prison, from Jonathan. His words were filled with sorrow, admitting the weight of his choices, asking, not expecting, for forgiveness. Ava held the letter for a long time, but she didn't respond, not out of bitterness, but because she knew her path now lay ahead, not in reopening wounds, but in healing what remained. The next day, she stood before a school auditorium, sharing her journey with a room full of young, hopeful faces. "In life," she said gently, "you may be hurt, you may be betrayed, but the greatest strength isn't in striking back, it's in building something good anyway. Be better, not bitter. Forgive, not because others deserve it, but because you do, because your peace matters." The children watched in quiet awe. Ethan gave a proud nod. Mia wiped away a tear. In her words, they saw more than a story. They saw a way forward. Ava's message rippled through the community. She became a voice for those who had none, a speaker, a mentor, a living reminder that dignity cannot be stolen and truth will always rise. One quiet afternoon, she sat on her porch, watching Mia and Ethan laugh in the sun. She smiled to herself, calm, whole, at peace. Looking up at the sky, she whispered, "Mom, Dad, I kept my promise, not with vengeance, but by creating something better, a world where goodness is protected, where justice lives." And in that quiet light, Ava knew the journey had come full circle. But even more importantly, she knew another one was just beginning.